Thank you, Peter. And Craig, as we're unlocking this value and getting into the scenario planning for businesses, for societal adoption of AGI, and keeping in mind that the business and the client of the future is very much still human and very much still physical, what are some of the key regulations and the legal challenges? There was a question that was posed to security concerns of proprietary data that has been engaged in. But what are some of these challenges that businesses will foresee in implementation? And the second layer also being that governments, if they want to champion AGI and AI and its multiple facet as they implement.
Yeah, so just a slight sneaky fun remark is perhaps the customer of the future is not a human, it's actually a machine that automates decisions on your behalf. But let's not go down that rabbit hole. I think that's a complete different conversation, right? So some of the concerns to think about, obviously the first one is the ethical and safety concern, very simply put, right? And again, if you premise that off the condition or the premise that it's a pattern recognition machine, then it becomes a simple kind of computer science data problem of garbage in, garbage out. And for that, look at the 2000s, the late 2000s of the Google, where they were indexing the image search. And we know it's a terrible example, but it's very true, where the training sets were around, is this a gorilla or not? And because the training sets are biased, and they were certainly back then, where they're easily recognizable around Caucasian faces, it misinterpreted the faces of gorillas as Africans, right? So there's a challenge around that, around the ethical concerns, because we've trained it incorrectly, either because the data sets are flawed, and all the explicit or implicit biases of our researchers, right? There's a saying, AI is racist, it's sexist, discriminatory. Not always the case. In many specific cases, it's because of the poor data that we have. So there's a huge area around the ethics around the use of technology, and that's a masterclass, and I'm sure Peter covers many times in his courses around the ethics around that. Beyond that, the question around data governance is absolutely key as well, because data is the oil, as they say. I don't want to say it's the new oil, because I think that's a lovely saying that captivates our mind. But data becomes super important because, again, the person that owns the best kinds of data in the context, again, of garbage in, garbage out, is the one that wins. So data security becomes a problem, because if you leak that data, you end up in a situation much like we had last week with Samsung saying to the employees, hey, you can't use ChatGPT. Stop uploading public data onto, ChatGPT. The same as the Italian government saying, please, we're not going to, in fact, not going to ask you. We're just going to cut it, right? Because of the potential around data leaks and the misconception, or maybe the truancy around the use of data and enriching that data set. Beyond that, the question of regulation becomes problematic, at least certainly in terms of the interpretation of regulation today. Regulation, like law, is based on case precedents. It's based off, this is what happened in the past, how do we extrapolate and apply the law now? Now we get into a realm where, with technology moving so quickly, we don't have precedents. Simple questions like IP and copyright protection, who owns certain things? Who owns music when AI can replicate it, right? For that, again, we can have a look at 2 weeks ago, was it last week? In fact, it was this week. Ed Sheeran and Marvin Gaye, right? Where Marvin Gaye's, his trust, I think it was, said, you're copywriting around the chord progression. And Ed Sheeran said, well, if you think about it, most songs actually have a certain kind of chord progression. So we're starting to move into a realm now where all the old rules of regulation aren't necessarily fit for purpose because they don't move fast enough, right? So that becomes a challenge. Regulatory, over and above that, over and above the data, over and above the ethics, there's obviously the questions around workforce displacement, which I see there's some of the questions. And do we move into a UBI system? Again, that's another conversation for another day, where we tax the machine owners and that money flows down. Or was that actually just a proxy to make the rich richer? I don't know. That's another fascinating conversation for another day. But for the government one, that's just where the government question becomes really interesting, because we see signs of this already, right? We see what's coming on. And the author, William Gibson, says the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And for that, have a look at places like China, where they look at the use of data and they can say, underpinned by large LLM models, we can start determining a social score in terms of what you're doing, and therefore will reward you and change the human behavior. So if you jaywalk, we're going to deduct points. If you're friends with someone who's unscrupulous, your social score goes down. And once you break the ceiling, or rather you break the floor of a certain number of points, you can't have access to certain services. Governmental-wise, that's a huge issue, because it allows us to justify the action of certain things, certain players in the role, in terms of the roles that they play, right? So now data gives us the ability, if used incorrectly, stuff. But from a government, or more importantly, from a block level, the blocks, the people, the countries, the organizations, the entities, the players with the most data are the ones that win. And from a government perspective, right now, I would say the US and the West is maybe advanced because of the advancement of technology, but because of the nature of displacement of technology, I'm concerned about closed ecosystems. Let me not say which countries, but closed ecosystems where they have the mandate to ensure that the government level, the national level, has the right for all that data. Because the ones with the data have the ability to then control a narrative, much like Peter's view. And again, look to the future, look at next year, already to this year. We've seen that the Republicans in the US have used AI to create customized AI-generated adverts. But the point is, from a government level, it becomes really incumbent to say we need to establish regulatory constraints in terms of where we use data, what are we using it, and more importantly, what's the use of AI to misinformation for misinformation purposes, or more importantly, just plain and simply for controlling our own populace. It becomes a huge, gigantic space.